Well, good evening. I'm William Anthony Hay, Associate Director for Public Programs here at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Very glad you could join us today for our lecture in the school's Civic Discourse Project. Our theme this year has been Sustaining American Political Order in History and in Practice. And today we have a timely discussion of national competitiveness. What makes countries thrive or not has become a pressing issue and a public concern. So we hope to take a more detached view that generates light rather than heat, and put that question of national competitiveness into an empirical and historical perspective. Now, this is the school's 8th year organizing the Civic Discourse Project for Arizona State University and for the Metro Phoenix area. We're very glad to continue our collaboration with Arizona PBS for another season of recording these Civic Discourse Project events. They archive all the events on their website and broadcast episodes in the spring of each year. You also can explore a video archive of our speaker events and webinars on SCETL's YouTube channel and on our ASU website. And that archive includes all the lecture and dialogue events in the Civic Discourse Project from 2017 onwards. So we are in, as I say, our 8th year that we've gone from a line in the state budget and a concept to a thriving program here at Arizona State with a graduate program, undergraduate program, majors, minors. And we've worked over the past 8 years to convene a high-level discussion in the Civic Discourse Project, not only showing that people can debate and disagree in a civil fashion, but also can discuss issues of civic importance. We provide substance as well as examples of civic engagement. This public project is an extension of the school's academic program. As I said, our courses, our curriculum, our degrees, and student experiences that strive to reconnect liberal arts with American civic education. And now on to our speaker. Michael Mazarr is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. Prior to coming to RAND, he served as a professor of national security strategy and as associate dean at the U.S. National War College in Washington, D.C. Mazarr has served as a special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as president and CEO of the Henry L. Stimson Center, and as editor of the Washington Quarterly at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He holds AB and MA degrees from Georgetown University and a doctorate from the University of Maryland. His recent publications include a series of studies from RAND on the societal foundations for national competitive advantage. And so I'm delighted to welcome Michael Mazarr on Why Nations Thrive, Qualities that Explain the Health and Survival of Democracy. Mike?
Thanks very much, Will. It's great to be here with you this evening. Really delighted to be talking about this important topic, and particularly happy to be here because I think what the school is doing is incredibly important, the approach it's taking to certain kind of topics of American cultural and social life. I want to start by telling you the story of two Americas. The first of these is incredibly powerful and kind of looms over the world in ways that it has continued to do for decades. We have today, 26% of global GDP is the US GDP, similar to the 1990s. Our GDP is $10 trillion bigger than the European Union, and about 30% bigger than all of the global South countries put together from around the world. For all the talk of China overtaking the United States, in the last 5 years, if you measure GDP in real terms, the United States has increased its lead over China. China is falling further behind the United States in terms of the size of its economy. Our per capita income is 7th in the world, behind a number of small, very rich countries. US per capita income is about $20,000 a year more than Sweden, $30,000 a year more than France, and US per capita income is about double that of Japan. Our unemployment rate is one of the lowest in the world. Americans start businesses at 2 or 3 times the rate of many European countries. Amazing statistics of this economic juggernaut. Now, the other America is an America filled with people, possibly including some of us, who are losing faith in our national experiment. And I'm going to read you a few statistics, and as I do, you can kind of try to find yourself in them, or if you disagree with them. If you're like most Americans, you're not terribly optimistic about the future of the country. A 2023 Pew poll asked about a few different issues, asked whether they were optimistic about the country's ability to maintain equality for all people. 28% were optimistic, 44% pessimistic. On the future of American education, 20% optimists, 60% pessimists. On the moral and ethical standards of our country, 16% optimistic, 63% pessimistic. Last month, Gallup released a poll asking about overall satisfaction with national trends. The satisfaction rate was 38%, the lowest they'd ever measured. They ask a different common poll question: are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the way things are going in your country? About the last 3 years running, the satisfaction rate's about 20%, dissatisfaction rate is 80%. And just a couple of days ago, the Financial Times reported on a new poll that of Americans 15 to 29, only about a third trust the federal government to do what is right. So these attitudes reflect something I think that we all have sensed in the last few years in powerful ways, that our society, many of its leading institutions, its information environments, its elites, is simply not working well enough to solve our problems and is not accountable to us as citizens in the way that it should be. Now, at the same time, this second America is an America that in many cases, not universally, can't get things done, at least in terms of public projects. The country that did the Manhattan Project, Apollo program, simply can't do those kinds of things effectively anymore. California, as you may know, has been trying to do a high-speed rail system. The original estimate was $33 billion. Now the estimate is $100 billion. They've spent $11 to $12 billion already and have not built 1 mile of actual track. We can't build Navy ships. The last 2 or 3 classes of major naval vessels have been vastly overcost and delayed, and some of them, one of them, they had to take the ships out of service after as little as 5 years because they simply didn't work. Our infrastructure costs, building roads and rail in general, 2 to 3 times those of Europe. We can't build affordable public housing. Affordable public housing programs typically end up costing 1.5 to 2 times as much as regular housing. Recently, the US government spent over $7 billion to provide EV charging stations and built about 7 of them after 2 or 3 years. So what are we to make of this? On the one hand, we have a country whose broad economic position and statistics suggest a continuation of massive power and leading position in the hierarchy of world great powers and countries in general. And yet we have a country that is so troubled and increasingly can't seem to get out of its own way. So tonight, in sort of an approach to answering that question, I want to talk about this topic of the inherent qualities of nations that make countries thrive, politically, but also socially, economically, technologically, culturally. And I'll share the results of this, about 3 years of research we did at RAND looking into this question of what are the essential characteristics of countries that make them dynamic, that make them coherent, that make them successful. Now, we were interested in part, and this work was funded by the Defense Department, they were interested in the context of the US-China rivalry. What are the characteristics that are going to determine the outcome of that? One of our findings was that in its post-war heyday, late 40s through early 60s, of the factors that we decided were critical, the United States reflected the most compelling, holistic combination of those, possibly of any great power in history. But across the political spectrum, if we reflect the views of many Americans, we don't see the country being at its heyday anymore. We don't appreciate this positive sum loop of these various factors that brought the nation to the apex of its powers. So I'll talk about the characteristics we came up with, and then I want to talk about some challenges. As much as the United States remains on top, key factors that could be perilous to democracy and our position in the world, 3 particular themes that come out of our research that I think give us a really useful diagnosis. Now, 3 quick qualifications at the outset. Number 1, what you're going to hear tonight is my opinion. This is based on RAND research, but the words that I'm saying tonight are just Mike's opinion. Secondly, the spirit of my approach and all of our research is thoroughly and entirely bipartisan. It was interesting to me in doing this research that the more you look into the sources of national competitive advantage, the sources of social stress and instability, the more I think it becomes clear that there is no diagnosis that makes sense from any one side of the political spectrum. And in our research, our findings and our recommendations from this RAND work, I was very gratified to actually see that our conclusions and our recommendations were kind of a random scattershot across things that Democrats and Republicans, left and right, whatever, would have thought to endorse. And then third, tonight I'm going to be heavy on diagnosis and light on prescription. I'm going to be talking about what our condition is and giving only the barest of hints of what we need to do at this point to make it better. So we started this work at RAND in 2022 with a specific but a very ambitious research question. What is it that makes great powers successful in long-term rivalries? Now, you could add up military power, size of the economy, size of the population, but our instinct was, with this office at the Defense Department that sponsored this work, that the qualities of societies actually make a big difference, the kind of society that it is. And to me, the best example of this is the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union both had some very advanced military technologies. The Soviet Union had a big empire. But ultimately, it was the dynamism of the open American society that made the critical difference. It just produced more innovation, more growth, more technology over the long term, and eventually the Soviet leaders got that. What it also produced was more political legitimacy in the United States than in the Soviet Union that kept people having faith in the American project. So if that's true, what are these qualities? We did a bunch of historical case studies going all the way back to ancient Rome. We looked at a whole bunch of different literatures that bear on this question. Like one really fascinating issue is something that's called the Great Divergence. Starting in about 1500, European countries raced ahead of the rest of the world in their economic development, their technological development, and there's an enormous literature trying to explain why. What are the qualities of those societies that made that difference? A lot of modern research on different factors. And we eventually came up with 7 characteristics that we think are the determining factors in long-term national vitality. And I'll just talk about them briefly. We can talk more in the Q&A if you're interested. So, first one, national will and ambition. Both internationally and domestically, the most competitive societies have a strong sense of drive, of will, of a desire to achieve. From a national perspective, they have a sense of their own exceptionalism. And groups within the society, scientists, business people, and others, have kind of a driving ambition, a desire to better themselves, a work ethic, all of this stuff that makes the country an engine of driving itself forward. Second characteristic, unified national identity. Pretty straightforward. Countries that are more unified as opposed to fragmented, as in the case of like the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Soviet Union. Countries with a sense of who they are, their identity, have a competitive advantage. And specifically, an identity that makes people in the society willing to sacrifice on behalf of the nation, in the military, but also in a lot of forms of volunteerism and philanthropy, other kinds of things. Third, shared opportunity. How well does the society get the talents of all of its people and not exclude potential scientists and innovators and entrepreneurs based on whatever factor? Fourth factor was something we called an active state. This is not meant to imply that the state runs the economy or the state has a leading role, but merely that in all of these historical cases, you see governments that take targeted, limited actions to catalyze national competitiveness, doing what they need to do to allow the rest of the society to have its effect. Now, in older times, this was creating simple rule of law. More recently, a great example is the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, that made a bunch of investments in the 60s and 70s that helped to create the internet and GPS and a lot of other leading technologies. So this is not a dominant government role, but it's a catalytic role in critical ways. Fifth factor, effective institutions. So I'll talk about institutions in a bit and define them, but sort of the major institutions in society, from banks to the rule of law to other kinds of organizations, norms. It's a common finding of economic and political science research that societies that have well-functioning institutions that allow the society to work efficiently have a huge competitive advantage. Sixth factor, one I think is most interesting, important, and hardest to define. a learning and adapting society. This is one of those things that's hard to define, but you really recognize it when you see it, and it leapt off the page of a lot of our historical case studies, where some societies just have an intellectual energy about them. They have a critical mass of people that are trying to push the frontiers of scientific knowledge. There's intellectual exchange. Scientists get together to talk about issues and debate them. And there's a sense of adaptive energy. So as things are learned, the society changes how it does things in response. And then seventh and finally, a factor we isolated was diversity and pluralism. So we mean diversity not necessarily just in the way that's become controversial, but in a very broad sense. Going back to the Roman Empire, for example, Rome managed to integrate talented people from many of its provinces in an amazing way, given this was happening in ancient times. Roman freedmen, freed slaves, became significant business people, contributed to society. So they had ideas and inputs from a lot of different sources. And by pluralism, we mean political pluralism. So societies that have a complex set of political governance, like in America, states, localities, as well as the federal government, you have all these little laboratories of public experimentation that gives you, in the long run, a competitive advantage. So those were the 7 things we came up with. One big theme that came out of the study beyond the 7 was the idea of feedback loops and kind of a holistic relationship among them. One common pattern you saw in countries that were the most vital was that positive versions of some of these characteristics would work with the others in a positive sum feedback loop. So you'd have good institutions allowing people to have more opportunity, which is supported by the intervention of an active state and so on. And then in countries, empires that had passed their peak, you see a negative version of that, where damage to some of these things plays off against others and creates a loop that can become self-reinforcing. So in the last part of the research, we assessed the United States. We looked at these 7 things, said, how are we doing? Now, one finding was, as the first America that I described would suggest, incredible areas of continuing resilience and strength. But we also found a lot of potential danger signs. Ebbing national willpower and confidence, fracturing national identity, a sense of opportunity that is denied to too many, institutions that don't solve our problems in the way that they once did. And we began to identify the risk that the United States could be in the early stages of falling into this trap of classic great powers and empires, that we are beginning to see the early stages of this negative feedback loop, where failing institutions undermine opportunity. A lack of national willpower reduces the incentive to adapt and learn. A divided society undermines the value of diversity and pluralism. And when you begin to have negative trajectories on all of these, they can kind of play together and have a significant negative effect over the long term. So having looked at the 7 and these kind of feedback loops, we identified a few big overarching themes or factors that, to me, play an especially critical role in determining the outcome of those sources of vitality and also determining what kind of feedback loop a society gets over time. And I want to say just a few words about each of these now, because I think they provide a really useful way, a diagnostic lens to get a sense of what's going on in the United States and where it is headed. And those are information, institutions, and elites. In the late Roman Republic, one of the cases we looked at, the public sphere, the information environment, became significantly corrupted, even compared to what it had been earlier. Politicians circulated lies about rivals. The public sphere became a contest of rival truths. People created fake documents and modified others to create fake news. Information circulation was governed by rumor, which changed the story on the 3rd or 4th telling. A lot of misinformation going around. Skilled orators were all about persuasion rather than fact. Cicero put it at the time, "Nothing is so unbelievable that it cannot be made plausible by speech," one of the characteristic factors of his era. Now, all that helped to undermine trust in public institutions, trust in the republic itself. And it was only one of many factors, but it contributed to, I think, the decay of the Roman Republic. And in our day, we're seeing a lot of these same things today. We call it fake news, we call it misinformation, disinformation, the death of truth. We've talked a lot about this in this country the last few years, but the idea isn't new. There's a really interesting 1962 book by a philosopher named Jürgen Habermas, who writes some stuff that's incredibly dense, as philosophers will do, but this one is pretty clear. He called it the structural transformation of the public sphere. He argued that there were a few trends, like the centralization of information and declining quality of public debates, were undermining the public sphere, the information space that we use to make decisions. But what I find really useful about his work is that he explains why an effectively functioning public sphere is so important. It offers a place where public and private domains can overlap, come together, and people can have debates that influence public policy. In the process, it legitimizes governance by the fact that people can see how the results come from this open debate. It creates a unifying force in society by allowing people to come together and debate these things in the open. So for a lot of reasons, a well-functioning public sphere is critical. And in one of our separate RAND report on disinformation, we at one point sort of put it simply as saying democracy, at the end of the day, is an information processing mechanism. That's in a lot of ways what it is. If a vigorous and well-functioning information environment is really important, then we are in some degree of trouble, because as we know, there's a lot of indicators of the decay of the public sphere in the United States and a lot of advanced countries over the last number of years. It's become more poisoned, polarized, unable to support the process so critical in a democracy that the public sphere is supposed to do. There's a lot of evidence for this, a lot of reasons why. But one fundamental reason, I think, at the core of it really, is the fragmentation of the public sphere, right? There's a former CIA analyst and now public intellectual named Martin Gurry who wrote a really good book called The Revolt of the Public. And his argument is simple. From a fairly unified, coherent, centralized information environment, some of us are old enough to remember 3 big television channels, a few big national papers, Walter Cronkite was the voice of the American people, that could moderate the public's understanding. The public sphere has collapsed into 1,000 shards, and people rely on YouTubers and influencers and 100 different websites and Substacks and all the rest. Gurry argues he has a term for this new information person, Homo informaticus, networked builder and wielder of the information sphere, poses an existential challenge to the legitimacy of every government he encounters. The resulting assault on authority has expanded to virtually every point in the social landscape where an established hierarchy confronts a public in command of the new platforms of communication. So the very nature of the public sphere is becoming broken into 1 million shards. Now, one result of this, as we know, is that large numbers of people have come to believe things that are pretty demonstrably untrue. So if this audience is representative of the American people, and I suspect it is not, but if it is, 20% of you think that the COVID vaccine had a secret microchip in it to track Americans. 1 in 5 of you also believe that 9/11 was an American conspiracy run by the government. 18% of you think the moon landing was faked. We've now had enough missions that they should have been able to take enough pictures to see if it's actually there. But much more important, I think, and more essential to the future of a democracy, if you are representative of Americans, 40% of you believe that whatever we are told about who actually governs our country, the real decisions are made by a secretive group of people behind the scenes that we don't know that are actually in charge of our lives. 40% of Americans. Now imagine the effect of that kind of a belief on the legitimacy of democratic governance. Now, challenge is, centralized, elite-dominated media was too narrow. Breaking it up to some degree is an important thing in a democracy. Conventional wisdom did become imprisoning, and lately, some attacks on so-called misinformation have wrongly gone after people who were just offering alternative perspectives. But what we face, I think, could still be called, and this is another project we're doing now at RAND, an epistemic crisis. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we learn. So a crisis of knowledge in society. We're just not sure who or what to believe. The very idea that there's a settled truth doesn't seem possible anymore. We don't believe experts or elites. And when people come to distrust experts and elites of any kind, the public sphere can't do the jobs that Habermas laid out for it. And it's dangerous to a democracy. And the development is coming at a very dangerous time, because we've got a bunch of issues coming down the pike. We're already here. Climate, biotechnology, something I'll say just a couple of words about, which is artificial intelligence, that we're going to need to make really fundamental decisions about as a society. And if we don't have a functioning public sphere that can address those, we could be in some trouble. Okay, let's look at my second nominated factor that helps to explain our predicament, and that is institutions. Of all the countries that you would have thought to lead the first industrial revolution, if you'd been in England in 1700, you would not have thought that that was going to be the country. Very backward compared to a lot of Europe at the time. And yet ultimately, by the early 19th century and into the mid-19th century, Britain achieved dominance of manufacturing output in ways that just impossible to believe. And it did this in part because of the effectiveness of its public and private institutions. Very strong banking and financial institutions that made credit available to businesses. A strong navy that guaranteed access to markets and protected the homeland. A sturdy parliament that maintained relative political peace and stability. Effective rule of law, including an imperfect but workable patent system that protected new inventions and allowed all this to go forward. And this British case reflects one of the, as I said before, one of the clearest points of consensus among economists and political scientists, and that is that institutions, which means everything from norms and habits of a society to its explicit laws, to the public and private organizations that contribute to governance, the effectiveness of those kinds of institutions is essential for national vitality and really in the long term for democracy. Well, as with information, if that's true in the United States, we have some challenges. One of the major findings of our work, looking at assessing the United States today, is that we've come to a place where, any generalization bears exceptions, but a lot of major institutions in our society are confronting a crisis in effectiveness, credibility, and legitimacy. And I'm going to highlight two reasons why. There's a number of them, but two in particular, just briefly I'll highlight. One is bureaucratic stagnation, right? Across many sectors and domains, large-scale organizations have become loaded down with layers of administrative bloat. They are fountains of rules, regulations, and paperwork. Workers across many fields spend as much time serving process as they do outcome or output. It's true in healthcare, higher education, in my field of defense for sure. My friend and colleague Michele Zanini is a management consultant and writer, researcher, who has spent years researching this issue and has abundant evidence across a lot of domains. One of his estimates is that in the private sector, excessive bureaucracy costs American firms over $3 trillion a year. Our institutions have become, in many cases, a drag on vitality rather than a spur to it, and as I talked about, have difficulty getting things done. But second, U.S. society reflects institutions not only that are slow-moving, but that are also increasingly menacing. So there's a British sociologist named Anthony Giddens. He has an idea of what he calls abstract systems. And by that he means all the big, generic structures that manage and operate modern life. So the banking system that makes your ATM work. The engineering mysteries behind a car's modern engine. The financial system, healthcare systems in many cases. Insurance industry. They are immense, they govern our lives, and for the most part, we have no clue how they work. As a result, he saw, even a couple of decades ago, a resulting disorientation, which comes from this nagging feeling of being caught up in a universe of events we do not fully understand and which seems in large part out of our control. But as long as they work reasonably well, we can get along with it. We can trust them. But an emerging pattern, I think, is that abstract systems aren't just big and complex. They're also, to a significant degree, predatory. They constitute, some of them, this looming background condition, threatening sudden adverse events that we can't necessarily explain, anticipate, fight. Judgments that jeopardize our economic and social security. A sudden police raid, an arbitrarily denied insurance claim, an IRS notice, a foreclosure, the list can go on and on. The simple and basic one is interacting with customer service. And I've called the resulting pattern predatory abstract systems. And when combined with their ineffectiveness, it creates this environment that drags vitality, but also makes Americans wonder about what's happening to our society. So as a result, and you know these statistics, the faith of Americans in the institutions of our societies has reached incredible depths. Only about 20% of us trust the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. 25% have a great deal or a lot of trust in banks or public schools. Less than 20% express confidence in newspapers, and about 10% of Americans express quite a lot of, or some trust in Congress and television news. Now, it wasn't always this way. Back in the 1960s, trust in government was about 70%. But that was before Vietnam, that was before Watergate, that was before Iraq, that was before 2008, that was before this whole list of things. So this philosopher I cited before, Habermas, has written of this issue too in really interesting ways. He talks about what he calls a legitimation crisis in the modern world. Crises arise, he says, when the structure of a social system allows fewer possibilities for problem solving than are necessary to the continued existence of the system. If you can't solve your social problems, you get a crisis because people do not have faith in the essential governing system. Such a legitimation crisis, a repeatedly and widely perceived inability of governing institutions to act effectively in the public interest, has a lot of outcomes that are poisonous to national dynamism and well-being and to the credibility of democracy. Habermas says it inhibits learning, goes after our learning and adapting value, because slow-moving bureaucracies simply are not interested in learning, causes public dissatisfaction and alienation. And it also threatens the softer forms of social institutions. Will and I were talking, Will's helped us with a couple of aspects of these studies. We were talking just the other day, and he used a really interesting phrase to describe this, which is the software of democracy. So Congress, major physical institutions of the hardware, maybe the software, norms, values, habits. And legitimation crises, Habermas says, are associated with weakening of traditional and cultural sources of solidarity. A society loses its identity, he writes, as soon as later generations no longer recognize themselves within the once constitutive tradition. And we've seen what happens historically when countries really lose a sense of national identity, one of our other major characteristics of national success. And this emphasizes to me the importance of steps to re-emphasize and revalidate aspects of national competitiveness, part of which the school is trying to do. So finally, our RAND study of the social factors that shape national dynamism and power found many cases that demonstrate a simple proposition. The most successful nations benefit from elites who have the public interest at heart, and they suffer when they get elites who are self-interested and amass wealth and power for themselves. Now, what do we mean by elites? We have a complex political science definition in there, but essentially it's the powerful in society. Wealthy, sure, but very influential people, very famous people, politically powerful people, the powerful in society. And what do we mean by public spirited? Well, we have a sort of a framework of factors that helps to define that. But essentially it is elites who believe that the national and local communities of which they are a part, the health of those communities is essential to the health of whatever their enterprise is, their business enterprise. They are devoted to the health of those things. They sacrifice for it. They join and serve in the military for it. They are philanthropic. They help lead national reform campaigns sometimes. They believe in and dedicate themselves to the health of the larger community. And a critical mass of those kind of elites is essential for national success for some obvious reasons. One is, if you look at a lot of historical cases, their norm-setting function. Elites tend to send cues about the behavior that is acceptable. They underwrite the legitimacy of social institutions by participating and investing in them. They tend to produce better long-term policies by not focusing on short-term gain. So the inverse of that is pretty obvious. If a mass of citizens believe that the elites in their society are out for themselves, they're hoarding power, they're hoarding wealth, resentments will grow, and again, the legitimacy of the democratic system will be in peril. But in just about all civilizations, this is exactly what you see. It is almost an iron law of social development that over the long term, elites in most societies tend to become more self-interested in very specific ways in terms, for example, of their economic behavior. And that is a pattern that has characterized great powers throughout history. So the question is, where does America stand in this process? Now, we can all identify hundreds of elites. We probably all have our favorites who are extremely public-spirited for whatever reason. They're philanthropic. They are fighting for the right kind of political outcome in our view, whatever it might be. Are they any longer characteristic of American elites as a whole? Do we think that the critical mass, the strong majority of American elites as we define them, is public-spirited? So, our framework points to these three issues of information, institutions, and elites as core explanations for the situation that we find ourselves in, which is that sometimes great powers and empires take a long time to decline. And measures of their power remain very significant, even as the underpinnings are being eaten away slowly by serious problems. And some of that may be going on. Those are some of the major findings of the research we did. I want to add one factor that we did not include in this research even a few years ago, just in a minute or two, because we're doing a lot of work on this at RAND now. I've been involved in this for the last year, and it intensifies and exacerbates all these trends and challenges I'm talking about, and that is artificial intelligence, AI. Now, a lot of people still not paying a lot of attention to it. Maybe some people playing around with some of the models to do some interesting things. There are enormous uncertainties around artificial intelligence, of how powerful it gets, how fast it moves, what it can actually do a year, 2 years, 3 years from now. But there are people in the labs and people following the technology that believe within a year, 2 years, 3 years, many of these models will begin to be good enough to replace millions and millions of workers in various kinds of jobs. They will be good enough to replace teachers because they will offer highly specialized, individualized, one-to-one tutoring with kids. They will create unbelievable new technologies, scientific breakthroughs. Now, this is the magical view or the strongest view of AI, and I'm not necessarily endorsing it. There's a lot of questions about how fast this can go. But we are sitting on the cusp of what may be the greatest technological economic revolution since the Industrial Revolution, and maybe even more significant than that. Because the Industrial Revolution was about human society getting new technologies, new industrial patterns. This is a revolution that demands that we rethink what it means to be human and what are the activities that humans have to engage in to make that real. And one of the challenges right now is that all of the discussion of AI, or much of it, if it's not just about how fast the technology is going, is about competition. It's about the labs competing with one another, and it's about America competing with China, and how can we get ahead of them? Discussions of what will this mean for us? How can we manage it? What does a society look like when you have agents running around, AI agents doing the work of many people? Huge questions we have to answer as a society, layered on top of these things I was already talking about. So, to return to that issue of the two Americas, America, rich, powerful, innovative, dynamic, alienated, mistrustful, fractured, losing drive and energy. AI has the potential to deeply exacerbate that difference by pulling apart a super empowered part of the country from much of the rest. And it raises questions of what kind of society we want to be. I think it may raise bigger questions for the future of our society than we confronted in 1776 or 1860. Because it really is not just about what kind of political form we take, but what kind of life human beings lead. So there's that huge question looming. Now, it may be that this all plays out way slower than the advocates are saying, and we have decades to figure this out. But some very expert people say we don't have that long. Okay, so when we take together the three factors, all of these challenges, this interlocking crisis of social legitimacy, a sense of a world out of our control, what it's doing to America, to our vitality, what is to be done? Well, in one of the follow-on studies, we looked at the issue of national renewal to get hopeful and looked at past cases of when great powers started to get into trouble and pulled themselves out of it. And we didn't find cases where they had really declined a long way and came back. But we found cases of what we called anticipatory national renewal. So a good example is Victorian England. So we start to get a lot of social problems from early industrialization, all kinds of environmental issues, labor issues, political issues. And by the 1840s, Britain is having more social violence than at any time in its recent modern history. We tend to forget that Britain went through, on this huge trajectory of economic growth, went through an incredibly unstable period, or difficult period. But what began to happen was a series of partly unconnected social movements that tried to address different pieces of these problems. One set of movements about the vote, about bringing the vote to a wider number of people, to women, and so on. A set of social movements about treatment of labor, treatment of women in society, environmental conditions, a variety of other things. And this happened over like 50 years. But there became a sense in the society that we're beginning to have problems we need to solve. You get a whole bunch of movements that re-legitimize the nature of the social situation over a period of decades. Similar thing happens in the United States from about 1870s through all the way through the 1960s in some ways. But the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, the reaction to some of the same challenges in the United States. What are the characteristics of this kind of movement? You need an accurate diagnosis of the problems. What do we really need to solve? You need a will on the part of the whole of society, or at least a lot of it, to try to get after those problems. You need, in the process of solving them, a portfolio of experiments, usually not kind of singular top-down mandated things. You need a critical mass of public-spirited elites participating in it. And those campaigns build on and reinforce, again, what Will described as the software of democracy, the values, beliefs, customs, habits of the society. They reinforce willpower and motivation. They give a new sense of shared national identity, specifically an identity of the country because we're working together to solve our problems. They find ways to spread opportunity. They go through all of our 7 factors. And they end up kind of establishing the power and vitality and legitimacy of these societies for another century or more. Now, Britain eventually has its problems with the Second Industrial Revolution, and they get into something called the British disease. But for a long time, this reform movement made a huge difference. So I told you that I was going to do a lot of diagnosis and not a lot of cure. One of the questions for us is, could we have such a campaign of national renewal in the United States today? Do we see some of the beginnings of the flickerings of one in a variety of places, again, all across the political spectrum, where people in different places are saying, this isn't working, our institutions need to change, we need to do this differently, we need to do that differently, beginning to organize around some of this. If we had such a movement, what would it look like? What are the main issues that it would focus on? Who would lead it? Those are the questions that confront the United States today, I think, in terms of the future of its vitality and the future of its democracy. At the end of all of our research, I remain very optimistic about this country. But as in some of those earlier cases, we have reached a point where we can either begin to make change to kind of restart the trajectory of American growth, greatness, the legitimacy of our democratic experiment, or we can sit by and watch as some of the problems that have become really very severe continue to eat away at those foundations. The time has come for this notion of anticipatory national renewal in the United States. I know that there are some, again, Republicans, Democrats, everybody, who have very much that thought in their mind, and I continue to be optimistic that we could see that over the next decade. And with that thought, I leave you tonight. Thank you so much.
Michael, thank you for a fine presentation about why nations thrive and how nations thrive. I'd like to open by bringing up a term that you didn't use, but it's a term that 2 figures, one American, one Briton, have brought up, and that is decadence.
Yeah.
That Ross Douthat, columnist in the New York Times, has revived the word decadence. And I think it's important to say what Douthat means by decadence. This is not an overly rich dessert. This is not something to do with sexual indulgence or sexual depravity, but decline. Indeed, some of these other definitions of decadence or meanings of decadence, really it's lean on a decline of moral standards or a decline of virtue. But Douthat is talking about a society that is not able to do what it once did.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting point. And he's argued that in everything from culture to administration, and even, shocking as it is to say, technology, the modern world and the United States has declined from where it was in the 1950s and the 1960s. And I bring up a British journalist and historian, Simon Heffer, because Heffer wrote a book called Age of Decadence on exactly the era you mentioned, the Victorian period, where Heffer's argument is that Britain lost its edge.
Yeah.
So where does decadence, where does decline come into your story?
Yeah, it's a great theme, and we use some of those sources in some of the research, and very familiar with Dowth's book. I think it's, in a lot of ways, the flip side of our first characteristic of national will and ambition. Because to me, the essence of decadence in the way they're talking about it is a society that's just kind of a big sigh. You know, it's like, I'm going to get a job and I'll do my stuff, but like, don't ask me to care all that much. So it's obviously that's sort of a glib way of thinking about it, but there's a lot of measures that can capture whether that's the case. And it's interesting, I think it's very similar, Fukuyama's book, The End of History. The full title is The End of History and the Last Man. And he talks about the people that exist at the end of history, which we no longer have. He was wrong about that. But his point was, his picture of those people, I think, is still relevant to this, which is people after history who just don't care that much about anything anymore. They're just bored. They're just kind of sitting around. And so it's that notion of, you could potentially have a reasonably happy society with decadent people. And in any society, as in American society, you have plenty of pockets of incredibly driven people who are creating all this economic dynamism that I'm talking about. But if you have a general society where, you know, when the suggestion is made, what's your ambition? What are you determined to do? What are you driving to do? The most common reaction is, I don't really have a lot of energy or I don't have very specific ideas. That's a challenge for competitive advantage. Arguably, it's a challenge for democracy, and it's a big difference. Well, it is somewhat of a difference between the United States and China. Interestingly, there's a very significant degree to which this trend is arising in the more developed areas of China as well. Among young people in China, there's something called the lay flat movement, which is all about just, chilling out, and I'm tired of working so hard. And you see it partly in the reaction in Japan and South Korea and China to traditions of 80, 100-hour work weeks and things like that. So to some degree, it is a natural result of postmodern societies where people say, okay, we got to this point, so I don't have to work 100 hours like people did 3 generations ago. But on the other hand, there's that fine balance of, do you get to a point where society just doesn't have a lot of energy anymore?
Well, the sense of no new worlds to conquer, no challenges to meet. Every generation has a test. And in Fukuyama's phrasing, after 1989 and then 1990, 91, the Cold War's over. We are now in a world at peace, so there's no test for us.
Right.
And that leads to, as Dan Dowth's formulation, you can't even make a good Batman movie anymore.
Well, and it's interesting, there's been, and you're familiar with it, like there's been, I'm sure many of you have read these things, a bunch of books about how the frontier mentality in the United States, the end of the frontier mentality, you lose something that, like, there was this drive that we're conquering the frontier, and that even, and of course Kennedy harks back to that, right, in the language. So it's interesting that generations after we had already gone through the whole frontier, that mindset still exists in the United States. And when that goes away, then you get you get World War II, you get these enemies that we're rallying against. But if there is a new frontier that we are dedicated to as a society, what is it exactly? And if we can't answer that, then do you end up with a challenge in this area of national will?
One might say is that the 90s were just a moment, and that every generation actually does face its challenges.
Sure.
And so the Fukuyama argument is a misreading of all of it. But that concern about decline, I mean, another figure, Corelli Barnett, the economic historian, who has argued that Britain entered a story of decline. But Barnett's point, I think Barnett was wrong about a lot of the 20th century, because Britain was much more technologically competitive than, and politically successful as well, than Barnett credits. But the argument he made, which is interesting and worth keeping in mind, is that the spirit, as you said, the national will that built empire, the spirit that won India, Robert Clive, in the in the mid-18th century, the spirit that survived and then prevailed in the Napoleonic Wars and established Pax Britannica, all of that faded out to, again, a kind of decline. And high-minded people faced domestic problems in the 1840s and 1850s. And you see moral reform movements, the remoralization of British society. And a little statistic there is that crime rates in Britain from the 1850s, 1860s declined for more than a century and only rose again in the 1960s. So that's a societal advantage. But it's a question of, can you lose that will? So your point about will is very important there.
And it's a really, obviously, it's a very tricky thing to play with.
Yeah.
Because, arguably Russia has a lot of national will right now, at least as expressed through Putin and his government. It doesn't always manifest itself in constructive ways. So, but in many times in U.S. history, it has. So, part of a national renewal, I think, would be, revalidating some goal for that and rallying people toward it.
Well, one of the things you noted in your presentation, and the example of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, the role not simply of elites, but dynamic groups.
Yes.
And dynamic elites.
Right.
And I just mentioned the case of moral revivals and reform movements, but there are also people who are innovators and how that can catch.
Yeah.
So positive dynamics can create a virtuous cycle,
right,
just as negative dynamics can create a vicious cycle.
Yeah. And we still have, obviously, a great advantage the U.S. has relative to most prior great powers at this moment is that we have, I think it's fair to say, a much larger continuing reservoir of innovative entrepreneurs, scientific advances, all of that kind of essential fuel of economic and technological advance. It remains very healthy in the country.
Let me shift the question before we turn to the audience questions. Let me shift to a different theme about elites. I recall David Eisenhower making a comment that the greatest generation was not really the generation that served under his grandfather, but the men who his grandfather's age, people like Dwight Eisenhower and George Marshall, the whole. And I think that, I forget the name of the author, but wrote a book, In the Time of the Americans. It might have been David Halberstam, who talked about that post-war generation in the United States that built the post-World War II order. That they really were examples of public spirit and accomplishment. And you find counterparts to that. Alcide de Gasperi, Konrad Adenauer in Germany, Gasperi in Italy, Adenauer in Germany. Japan and Charles de Gaulle in France, a generation of men who stepped up when their society required it.
Yeah.
What makes a generation like that, and where have they gone?
Well, good questions. In terms of what makes them, partly the difficulty is, I think, and we had a couple people who've done a lot of work on that era of those American leaders involved with us in thinking about this elite question. Partly it's the software, it's habits, norms, but in particular, these guys, because they were guys at the time, were a product of the Eastern establishment elite, right? Which inculcated certain kind of values, their prep schools and all that, of public service. And so that was great as far as it went, but that's not a system that you could or should preserve for the long term. You're going to have to open up society more widely. So I think to some extent it was that. And to me, one of the fascinating things about that period and into the 50s and 60s is similar attitudes in the US business community, where there's really interesting evidence about, if you go back and look at like IBM, other major corporate annual reports from the 50s and early 60s, there's all this discussion about how we don't survive without the health of our community. We are devoted to that, and they'll have lists of their priorities, and their share price is number 5 or something. This is before kind of the shareholder revolution and how to think about things. And you had, the data on this is not definitive, but a lot of anecdotal evidence that business leaders tended to think that they should live in their communities. There were a lot of medium-sized firms anyway. A lot of ways in which the business community manifested this notion of public spiritedness that, and one of the things we stress in this work is it's not all about people's attitudes changing, like business leaders thinking, oh, I don't care about my community more. The structural surroundings change. So globalization happens. The shareholder revolution happens. So now if you're a corporate leader, you have to operate globally and you become disconnected from communities as a natural result of that. You will not keep your job if your share price doesn't hold up over the course of several quarters or a couple of years. So the context for the decisions that elites are making affects those decisions a lot too.
That's a very important point about the institutional and structural context. And I'm paraphrasing Marx, we make our history, Marx, right, but not as we choose, because we're stuck in a situation. Well, the situation in an earlier period, if you are the president of the bank in Baltimore, for example, you have a commitment to the city of Baltimore and it's thriving because they're your customers, they're your borrowers, they are your depositors. So if they don't thrive, your bank and you don't thrive. But if you are head of the Baltimore regional branch of a global bank, then your interest is to move up in that global bank, and your interest is somewhat severed from, for example, Baltimore. Mm-hmm. And you think about manufacturing industries. There are many cases of manufacturing companies where there wasn't an egalitarian sensibility at all, but there was a membership of community. Yeah. And so local leaders felt a responsibility to those within the communities, instead of becoming detached from them. That it wasn't looking to New York or looking to LA or even looking to Chicago, but it was how do we make our space and our community better and stronger.
It interacts with Robert Putnam's argument about bowling alone and the decline of community associations in the United States, the Rotary clubs and all that sort of stuff, which were commonly like that local business leaders and other elites were the driving forces of those things, and then they also became engines of supporting, so partly with these same processes, and for other reasons, those have declined over time.
Well, one of the interesting things about that is that elites were leading non-elites or others in the community because you had mass membership organizations. Mm-hmm. Rotary is a good example, right. Civic groups, chambers of commerce. And so it wasn't just a few people calling the shots. They were providing leadership where others could join and indeed become leaders themselves. Yeah. And so there was a dialogue between, and indeed this was true in other ways. One could say labor unions, churches in many cases, that you have a responsibility to the parishioners, to the wider community. And so there's a reciprocal. But then when you become disengaged from the membership, that changes the incentive structure. In difficult and dangerous ways.
Yep.
Well, let us open up to audience questions, please. If you have a question for our speaker, for Mike Mazarr, please step up and ask it. We have a microphone set up so we can catch your voice. Please step up to the microphone and speak. If you have a question, ask it. If you have a speech, don't give it.
Hi, Paul Cederberg. I do not have a speech. Why do we not mention religion and the power of religious belief in fomenting our will, our drive, and talking about religious revivals in tough times, Civil War, after the First World War. Maybe not after the First World War, but after the Civil War, there's a tremendous religious revival. And we may be in one right now. But why don't we mention, because you talk about will and drive, where does that come from?
Well, it's a good question, and nothing, obviously intentional in terms of leaving it out. It primarily because the main focus for us was kind of historical and strategic, and among these different great powers we looked at, it becomes the religious aspects that are going on within them, I think, are part of the general social cultural value process that can be expressed in a variety of different ways. So. The main focus of our initial research was not so much on kind of social movements, although that's where some of the implications go. It was about tracing the fates of nations over time, and so we just didn't gather data. We weren't sort of looking at that. But it's a fair point you make, and obviously, when we're talking about this software of a democracy, values, norms, habits, the only 16% of Americans that are optimistic about the values of the country. There are some folks who are secular but still would have the same concerns, but clearly religious organizations, faith, that aspect of it is very much a part of that component, sure.
Yeah, and 80% of Americans are spiritual. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, I think that the question of religion is a very important one. It's somewhat outside the remit of some of the studies. But where do we learn virtue? How do we define virtue?
Yeah.
And in the modern era, this has typically been done through religion and the obligations that religion teaches, the self-control and the sense of duty that religion teaches is very important. Of course, many of the moral movements, I don't say reform because that can have a certain, that word reform can have a political or a structural and administrative meaning I'm not looking to carry. But things like temperance movements, things like reforming habits, the tendency to turn away from cycles of disorderly mores to a more structured and orderly way, that has been an important theme in many Western societies. And many elites, even if they fell away from the precepts of traditional Christianity, were very committed to the idea of doing the right thing and understanding living a life of service.
So, sorry. I like your idea about elites losing their public interest. I wanted to ask, though, at least in the security realm, a lot of focus has been on trying and failing is often punished more than not trying at all. Incurring political costs, incurring audience costs, and then failing leads, especially in democratic states, to more, to governments losing power, to politicians losing power. And so it seems like that could be incentivized. Rational actors, these people who have lost a sense of public duty, could be incentivized from not doing anything about these broader ideas because not doing anything is safer for their political future than doing something and failing. Is there a way to, did you guys look at incentivizing doing something and failing and moving that rational actor towards doing something as opposed to hoping for a national revival through public spiritedness?
So can I just ask a quick question,
Yeah.
which is when you say doing something and failing has been disincentivized, when you say doing something, what do you have in mind?
I'm thinking particularly about, in the security realm, that would be starting a conflict. But in the political realm, I'm thinking of the Social Security reform movement, 2005.
Okay.
George Bush brings it up.
Okay, yeah.
Invests a lot of political capital.
Yeah.
And fails miserably.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, because I think part of the answer is there's obviously a whole bunch of different issues, right, where some of them have that characteristic, basically anything trying to get a hold of the debt. And debt I didn't talk about at all, but great powers and empires that run themselves into financial irresponsibility, that is one of the guaranteed and classic routes by which they fail, and we're on the path. And getting off the path is going to take some very painful action, which nobody's incentivized to do. But then there's other issues where I think that it's not quite the same. I mean, if we look outside the political realm, if you're looking at the business community, yes, you could say that trying to make, like one of the things we document is the level of philanthropic giving on the part of the American corporate community, which is not great. And, you know, obviously this argument about the American corporations and the degree to which they serve Americans is no longer partisan. You know, you've got folks like Orrin Cass, a Republican theorist, J.D. Vance, lots of people have been talking about this for years now. So, yes, they would have to be courageous in the sense of maybe taking a risk with their job in terms of if they were to make an argument that reduced their share price for a little while or their profits, their revenues. That's some of it. But I don't, you know, and in the political realm with some issues, that is certainly it. Just personally, from the evidence I've seen, how I read the evidence, I think it's much more of an issue of values and habits and general mindset and orientation. which is in a globalized, cosmopolitan, and we won't get into the sort of whatever self-interested era that we live in, but for elites in particular, there's an environment in which oftentimes the expectation of acting in a public spirited way is separate from the incentives, but the expectation, responsibility, just to the point of these earlier generations in the United States or in England just isn't there in the same way that it was. To me, that's a more fundamental thing.
I think there's a language that would be very difficult to use today, a language of duty and of obligation that would have come naturally to much earlier generations. But today it would sound stilted and odd to people. So that is a disincentive to say, I will put my duty first. Your name and your character, that strikes to people, even people under 40, that strikes an odd sound. It seems dated. Not even an old movie, but an old novel. But I do think that entrepreneurism is incentivized in American society. And so that kind of risk-taking, and there's a certain generosity in the American spirit that is incentivized. But the question makes me think of one risk, and that is with big projects that fail. And when you take some great adventure and you put the nation behind some project and the project turns out badly. Prohibition was described as a noble experiment, and nothing did more to promote the growth of the mafia in America than prohibition. But and promoting alcohol consumption in bad situations. So when you have a great project that fails, that can be discrediting.
I was thinking of the invasion of Iraq when you mentioned similar.
Yeah, this is the Banquo's ghost, right?
Well, and that is like the balance over the last few decades of, like, if we just sat down and someone said, okay, make a list of all the major public projects that you're aware of that were successes and those that failed.
Yeah.
There are definitely some successes based on their original intent, whether you agree with them or not. But the list of failures in terms of governing elements of society and some of those big adventures seems longer, yeah.
So this is the danger of taking risks, imprudent risks, careless and reckless risks.
Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering what you guys thought about wealth inequality being the driver of a lot of these issues.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. Great book. I'm seeing most of the social disintegration that's happening in America is a result of the fact that every action we take is being monetized and commodified.
Yeah.
Even aspects that we thought impossible. All social life itself is going online because every second you take, it makes money.
Yeah.
And the other aspect is societies disintegrate when wealth inequality gets too high. It happened in on the eve of the Russian Revolution, happened with the rise of fascism in Germany. To what extent do you think that's driving these issues?
I think it's definitely one of the symptoms of what's going on. It's definitely a significant cleavage in society and the source of disaffection, alienation, yes. The trick is in determining what threshold of inequality is too high for a society to sustain itself. We did a lot of work in this project, doing some historical comparisons to the extent that there is data, and a lot of, you go back more than a couple decades and people are kind of inferring a lot of stuff into some limited economic data. But there have been a lot of times in American history that were, at least several that were close to recent levels of inequality. If it continued to worsen, this is one of my worries about AI, in theory, is if a lot of jobs get taken away, and if people are given sort of a subsistence level universal basic income, but a relatively small number of firms and super powerful individuals are getting now you really accelerate that. I'm in no way endorsing the current level of inequality or saying that it's not a problem. It contributes to a sense that society doesn't serve the interests of average people. It is true that over the last several years, income growth on the lower parts of the income scale has outpaced income growth on the highest end just in the last few years. Now, you've got a huge gulf to make up, right? But It does not appear to be a rapid trajectory entirely in the wrong direction. There's some dispute about some of the numbers. So I think it's a serious problem. From the evidence I've seen, I would not say we're on the brink of social disaster strictly because of that. I think it could be addressed in useful ways that turn the meter somewhat in the right direction. But I almost feel like a lot of other guarantees that empowering Americans, for example, against massively funded or organizationally powerful legal attacks is just as important as addressing inequality, just as an example.
Insecurity may be a better term
Yes.
than inequality. And we didn't talk about the French case, but the part of the story around the French Revolution is what is called a revolution of rising expectations. People thought things were getting better, and then they felt them not to be.
Yeah.
And there would be a concern of people saying that the next generation will not, your generation will not live as well as your grandparents or as your parents. That is a recipe for social decay.
Yep.
One last thing I want to say. Do you think, in terms of how political campaigns are funded with super PACs, FEC versus Citizens United, do you think that because corporations in the top 1% are allowed to basically fund half of most campaigns, do you think that causes roadblocks to making those changes?
So as an American citizen, I'm not happy with that situation. That was not part of our research, and so I really shouldn't, I don't have any analytically grounded conclusion to give you on that.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I just had a clarifying question about an apparent paradox. You were talking about how Americans are disillusioned to the large and abstract institutions that we currently find ourselves subject to.
Yeah.
But we don't quite understand. But if all Americans did try to understand these abstract institutions that we rely on, we would become not productive people because we would spend our life here at university instead of going out and being productive.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, how do we rectify this apparent paradox where people who don't understand institutions we rely on are beginning to be disincentivized to trust them without forcing them all to try to understand them and therefore become unproductive people?
I think the answer, it's a great point. I think the answer is we're not going to fully understand them. In modern, complex society, it's just impossible. Do we feel protected against them? Do we feel like they can take advantage of us arbitrarily and without any recourse? Or do we feel like if a big business sues us because, the famous farmers cases, right, of the seed that goes across to a farmer's field and they get sued for the intellectual property violation, or somebody sues someone to try to silence them or something, is there some legal aid thing you can call on to say, in our society, no one should be fundamentally handicapped in fighting big power because they can't pay enough for lawyers to fight this? We don't have that existence. So in a lot of those ways, I think if Americans felt like they couldn't be taken advantage of as much, and also if the bureaucracies were reformed enough so that the decisions were made more quickly, more fair, all that sort of stuff. So I think there's ways of getting around that. Yeah, I'm never going to understand what's going on in the ATM machine, but it can still feel fair if it operates a certain way.
Thank you.
Hi there. I wondered if you could spend a few minutes putting your comments in a broader international context. Coming from the UK, it seems to me that what you say resonates hugely with the challenges that the UK is facing.
Yep.
I think you could argue that Germany is facing the same range of issues. It broadly applies to Western Europe and that era of development. You could look to the emerging nations of the East as examples of thrusting societies that perhaps are not so decadent.
Yeah.
And then you've got the sort of very interesting contrast with China and its recent rapid emergence and its fostering of an intellectual elite that's been so productive, but at the same time, these domestic tensions that are arising. So could you just spend a few minutes, I mean, is this a global issue? I'm sure it's not just a specific US issue.
Right. So fascinating question, and we could do a whole other session just on that, right? And I'll just say a couple of quick things. Clearly, a lot of parallels in Europe. A lot of these concerns are motivating some of what are called the populist or sometimes far right or whatever parties there. The motto of Brexit is take back control, right? The mindset that things are out of control and I have to have more control over it. And similarly, the sense of institutional stagnation. There have been a number of reports, as you know, of kind of major reform ideas coming out in the UK. The Draghi report for Europe as a whole has recently come out and that the EU is now very interested in, which is basically we've got ourselves stuck into these systems that are not, efficient and productive enough. So yeah, a lot of those same kinds of concerns. And as I've mentioned, they're beginning to crop up. It's been very interesting to do a little comparative work on some of these Asian societies, because like in Japan, you'd say there's no populist movement in Japan, what's going on, aren't they as alienated? All sorts of interesting cultural reasons for the differences. But certainly among some younger people in South Korea, Japan, and China, you begin to see at least versions of some of these sorts of things. So yeah, it's definitely, as you would expect it to be, because these are hallmarks of kind of advanced, gigantic, postmodern society. So you would expect them to be present to certain degrees everywhere. And then all these fascinating cultural differences kind of moderate what actually happens. But yeah, very much a global trend.
And how do you see China sitting in this?
So really hard to say. I was just thinking, I do a lot of work on US-China strategic relations, and there's this enormous amount of anecdotal evidence that there, especially after COVID, there's a real rising sense of questioning the legitimacy of the overall social system in ways that you didn't hear about 10 years ago, particularly among young people. How prevalent is it? We just don't have very good evidence for that. I think certainly it is true that from the government through a lot of the business, military, and society in general, my instinct is that, as you kind of implied, there's still a much higher proportion of national will and ambition because it's a rising country that's claiming its rightful place in the world. That's their frontier. That's their goal. So you would expect that. But it may be that certain parts of China have raced into the advanced postmodern era so quickly that they're getting themselves into our level of social disaffection faster than you would expect their overall development to achieve. I don't know. It's a fascinating case. The data is just not great, very anecdotal.
Thanks so much.
The comparison with East Asia brings some interesting points to mind. I wonder whether in Japan, certainly in Korea, there's a lot of talk about the distance between men and women, particularly younger men and women in Korea, and the resistance to an exam culture. Mm-hmm. I could certainly see when you mentioned the laying flat movement in China and the reactions to post-COVID. These could be local variants on a rejection of a public sector in Britain, for example, and infrastructure that doesn't work and is decayed. Mm-hmm. Or in Germany, trains that don't run better than they run better than in the US or better than the UK, but not the way Germans expect.
Although I just read recently that UK trains are more on time than German trains on average.
Which is an interesting point. And it gets to a sense of, where have we gone wrong? Where is this decline coming in?
Well, and the Germans are now asking, after all this time of Germany being the economic engine of Europe,
the
hilarious thing, the last couple of years, or maybe just last year, Greece had a higher growth rate than Germany. So I'm sure there's a lot of, after years of Germany telling Greece, you got to get your act together and we're going to impose austerity and all the rest. Now the Greeks are like, guys, so do we get to tell you now how to change your country? Ma'am.
So my college age student showed me his dating app, and when he swipes, it'll sometimes say vaccination status and who they voted for. Oh. And we talk about a national identity being fractured, but one thing I'm really curious about, I work in kind of a faith community. We're seeing political identity supersede all other identities. Yep. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if you've done some studies on, it was very healthy for people to have plural identities and to be involved in different ways. Mm-hmm. How is that affecting our culture now?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing I will say is if you have a high school age kid who shows you his dating app, you have done something right as a parent, because a lot of us would never have that. We gathered a bunch of data on that in terms of the unified national identity piece and assessing that of the United States. So one of the really stark things that leapt out to me was polling evidence that said, like, 50 years ago, half of American parents would have been concerned if their child married someone of another race. Now that's down to like less than 5%. Huge win for our society, right? But today, 50% of American parents would be concerned if their child married someone of another political party. In so many ways, what has gone from, I belong to a party, I'm proud of it, I prefer their ideas, you know, you have different ideas, we meet in the public sphere, we debate it out, and then we'll be part of the Rotary Club together at the end of the day, has become a much more zero-sum mentality on the part of people, partly as a result, across the political spectrum, right, of political leaders who have cultivated that reality for their own occasional good. And yeah, so I think that clearly there are historical cases where that kind of polarization contributes, along with other factors, to undermining the legitimacy of the society because it's no longer seen as a shared enterprise. If I can impose my view, then I'm happy. And when I can't, then the enemy's view is being imposed, and that's, you know. It's one of the reasons why I was so, I mean, you know, RAND is inherently a nonpartisan organization, but I was really delighted that when we got sort of the end, I was like, wow, this is just such a random portrait of conservative and liberal notions that are findings and what we think ought to happen, that it points in the direction of people coming more, you know. So yeah, the numbers are very stark. It is a significant challenge. Now, there's a countervailing set of data, which is you can ask Americans a lot of basic questions about the essential values of our country, and 70 or 80% of Americans still sign up to them. So there is evidence that the vast majority of Americans still have a decent idea, a shared idea, put it that way, of what they think their country is, what they want it to reflect, and so on. And as part of my general optimism, I think that in my view, it would not take that long if we had a nonpartisan, bipartisan, several years of political leaders actively trying to lead us back together. It would not, to my view, take that long to get back to a better place. The question is whether we expect our politics to deliver it. And again, not always because of the preferences of individual politicians. The systemic factors are now almost in charge. But yeah, that kind of polarization is definitely dangerous to democracy.
Well, there's been a great sorting, thinking of systemic factors. Parties in the United States used to be coalitions, partly regional and economic coalitions. And there's been a great sort where you don't have a John Lindsay liberal Republican or a John Stennis conservative Democrat anymore. Harry Byrd as another conservative Democrat of an earlier era. These are names that few except political historians or the equivalent of stamp collectors would recognize. But there's been a great sort now, so you can code in a way that wouldn't have been true even in 1960.
Yeah, the attitudes in voting. And I'm old enough, I mean, I worked on the Hill for a number of years a while ago for a congressman who was at that time chairman of the Democratic Leadership Council, which was the group of moderate and conservative Democrats. The DLC no longer exists as an organization. Now, there are still Democrats that describe themselves as moderate and conservative. But yeah, it's an entirely, and that was like 60 members of the House at the time, I think, were part of the DLC. So you had this, not only in terms of ideas, but then in terms of the practical political alignments and cooperation that went on. It's just a very different world.
And I think that's part of the dynamic. So the question, plus the internet, swiping and so forth, it makes me wonder, you know, is this a moment or is it a structural change?
Yep.
In terms of, we have time for one last question.
Thanks very much for a great presentation. The two of you, a great discussion. Just one comment, a plug on the religious spiritual culture question. 2 points on that. Robert Putnam's follow-on book to Bowling Alone is American Grace with David Campbell of Notre Dame about religion and American culture. And secondly, toward the end of his life and career, Habermas had a very public dialogue with a somewhat obscure German theologian, Catholic theologian, who went on to get a big promotion. Pope Benedict XVI. So Habermas, from the secularizing side, Habermas took that question seriously what that meant for European civilization, but beyond. So my quick question, civics and civic education, does that come up in your analysis and your recommendations about these
So I'll
these
say a
questions?
quick words, and then clearly it's part of the work of the school. So no, in the sense of like civic education is kind of beyond, is more specific than any of the recommendations we looked at or things like that. But, you know, one of, and I mentioned it a few times, and it's why I think that what the school is trying to do, its approach it's taking is so interesting and important, is the point you raised of where does virtue come from in a society? It seems like an old-fashioned question to ask, but in so many of these characteristics we're talking about. Now, religion can be a major source of that. There can be secular sources too, but that idea of ideas like duty, responsibility, commitment, aspects like that, it would be a very big, well, these experiments have been run before in societies that get to a point where those are no longer really prevalent aspects of how people think of their lives, and those experiments tend not to end well. But the trick is, as we all know, there are what we would say virtue entrepreneurs who want to come at us and use that for whatever partisan purpose or the, you know. So in what way can we, and also because of the partisan split, how could we begin talking about this in ways that people of all different, you know, persuasions could come together and say, well, you know, look, liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans both believe in virtue. They talk about it slightly differently, but in a lot of ways they talk about it in the same ways. And so I think, you know, just to put a plug for the school, the kind of approach of teaching classic American notions of U.S. history, American civic values, things like that, which has not had the same emphasis in, at least in higher education in recent years, is part of the answer, I think. I'm skeptical usually of answers to any social problem that says, well, teach more. Like for the information problem, well, give them a lot of critical thinking education. Okay, I got it, but it's bigger than that. And also, you know, it's not that we can turn our universities into teaching kids what the right virtues are, because we don't always want them to make that choice. So it's very complicated, but finding our way back to a more consistent national expression of that, I think, personally, is part of the solution.
Well, providing a script, not in a didactic way of saying you must believe this, or this is truth with a capital T and in bold-faced letters, but providing a script for what it means to be virtuous in ways great and small. And schooling did that. I use the word schooling deliberately because I'm thinking of K through 12, or really even elementary or grammar school up through high school. That was a common thing. And things, literature and history, many things were moral tales that had a moral lesson, not in a didactic and certainly not in a partisan way, but that, you know, that virtue brings a reward and that vice brings punishment, and that was an accepted sphere. So, or an accepted approach. I wonder whether the postmodernist questioning of is there truth? Can we find truth? Is there an actual objective truth? Doesn't lead to a kind of amoral familialism, as Edward Shills will have it. Well, you have your truth, he has his truth, she has her truth, which makes us all arbiters of what is right and wrong, and in our own interest.
Yeah.
So, but I just want to thank you all for coming and joining us for this very fine talk and dialogue we've had here today. On April 2nd, we will have Mary Elise Surratt, a noted historian, coming to speak on her book, Not 1 Inch, a study of post-Cold War international order and the crisis of U.S. and Russian relations. So that's coming up April 2nd. And so I encourage you to please come and join us. Details are on our website. I'd like to thank all of you all and thank our staff, and above all, thank Michael Mazarr for a fine talk.
Thank you so much.